Hello, it's Peter Wright and Kathleen Beauvais with another episode of the Yakking Show, Harmony, Your Path to Wholeness channel. And we lead you along the path to wholeness and a better life by bringing you interesting guests who are experts in their field. Today is no exception. This is an exciting one. I've been following this guest on X, or as it's now called, for some months. I really enjoy her tweets. I think they're still called tweets. But first, let's introduce Kathleen, co-host. Hi, Kathleen. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Peter. Thank you. And thank you also very much for tuning into our show. We so appreciate having you. And as Peter mentioned, we do have another special guest with us today. We are so privileged to welcome Stephanie Winn to the show. Hello, Stephanie. Welcome to the show. How are you?
Hi, Kathleen and Peter. Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Stephanie is a licensed marriage and family therapist located in Portland, Oregon. She now spends most of her time counseling individuals, couples, and young people who have been harmed by gender ideology. Today, she's here to yak with us about therapy, mental health, and gender confusion. So let's just jump right in. Stephanie, what made you question gender affirmation practices that most therapists have been trained to follow?
Well, thank you. And actually, before I get to that, just a slight correction.
Sure.
I actually took a break from counseling a few months ago. As you know, I've had some health challenges that have forced me to be really judicious with how I spend my energy. And I'll get to your question in a moment because it's all related. I went from just being a therapist to being a therapist and podcast host to a consultant and started, adding all these dimensions to my practice as I got involved in the greater community of people who are concerned about what has happened to the counseling profession and the harm that's been done in the name of mental health. And so a few months ago, feeling spread thin and having another wave of illness, I basically chose to focus exclusively on consulting right now and setting aside therapy because, among other reasons, it feels like the most important use of my particular skills and energy right now. So, although I have spent a good deal of time over the past 10 years working full time as a therapist in different settings, including private practice, um, and I have, as you mentioned, counseled detransitioners in as part of that. What I'm doing right now is parent consulting. That's the main thing. And so one way that consulting differs from therapy is that I'm not diagnosing or treating a mental health condition, and I'm
Mhm.
actually a lot more directive. So as part of the consulting contract that I establish with my clients, it's, while I can't guarantee any particular outcome, you are here because you are desperate to save your kid from making permanent alterations to their body that could have a lifelong impact. So let's work on understanding gender ideology and how it's impacting your kid's mood, behavior, and actions, and thought process. And let's understand how to recognize patterns and predict their future behaviors. And then let's work on the one thing that you can control as a parent, which is how you communicate with your kid. So sorry, I just had to
That's quite all
sort
right.
of give that information up
Sure.
front.
No, that's great because as you started talking, I was thinking to myself, what's the difference between consulting and therapy? So you answered that very well. I have a very clear picture in my mind now. Thank you for that. So tell us about the harm that's being done to many young people who I would say even a decade ago would have been treated for various mental disorders, but now they're frequently diagnosed with as being gender dysphoric. What's happened and why the change?
There's a huge debate in the mental health field that you could sort of view as a chicken and egg issue. So there's a large swath of the population of mental health practitioners who really have bought this idea, and this sort of ties into your initial question, Kathleen, this idea that this so-called gender dysphoria and this narrative about being born in the wrong body
Mhm.
is the underlying cause of every other mental health condition. And that if you treat that underlying cause with these invasive, costly, permanent physical interventions, as well as social affirmation, which also has downstream consequences, that everything else will resolve, or that everything else is unrelated and that you still need to make the person's identity central to how you view and treat them. That is that is one belief system, and it's becoming increasingly apparent that it's not founded on any evidence to support any of those ideas. Then there are the concerned professionals like myself who say, you know, this idea of being born in the wrong body is just a narrative that someone is ascribing to their problems. This concept of gender dysphoria or the scapegoating of the sexed body is just the latest trend in how young people are absorbing from the culture around them that they should conceptualize their distress, and it gives them something to latch onto. But that doesn't necessarily tell us that it's the root cause. In fact, there's no evidence that that is the root cause of their psychiatric illness. And the concern is that with any other psychiatric distress, we start with the least invasive interventions possible. Talk therapy. Hopefully there's some holistic support with, you know, improving lifestyle, such as sleep, nutrition, exercise, and things like that. And then maybe, depending on your orientation, the severity of the symptoms, and so on, maybe you provide that person a referral for medication, or to talk to someone about medication, a prescriber. But we work in order from least invasive to moderately invasive with something like medication, right? And that is the conservative approach, not politically conservative, but just conservative in terms of being protective of the individual. And we're very concerned about those who have flipped everything and said, let's just assume that all the other issues this person is having are either unrelated to their gender or downstream of their gender, and let's change that whole person in these really permanent ways.
Right.
Okay. So can I jump in with a follow-up to that? That I'm 73 years old. My wife is the same age, and I can remember at school there were some boys who were a bit on the effeminate side, right? They liked ballet and didn't want to get involved with sports and that sort of thing. And my wife tells me that her and a whole lot of girls her age at sort of late childhood, early teenage, like climbing trees and wearing boys' clothes and coveralls and playing with cars and riding horses, but they all grew out of it, right? And that seemed to be the natural way people would progress. Obviously, there were kids with serious mental issues, but we didn't see many of them. That whole thing's been turned upside down now, that as soon as someone shows signs of not perhaps being a proper boy or a proper girl, the solution is, as you say, invasive surgery or medication. Is this again, what has led that? Is it ideology that's led that? What's happened? Social pressure?
Well, actually, at the risk of sounding all doom and gloom, Peter, it's actually worse than that. It's not just anymore that it's the so-called gender nonconforming kids that are being pushed down this pathway. It's everyone. I'm not saying 100% of the youth, but
Sure.
I, as a parent consultant, I hear so many stories of kids who were actually quite typical for their sex when they were younger. So the way that I view this is I've been in the mental health field for 11 years now, just long enough to see that exponential growth curve that we've seen in the number of young people identifying as trans. So I've witnessed this firsthand. And looking back, I think what's happened is that it started with the weird kids and the so-called gender nonconforming, or what I prefer, a more neutral term, gender atypical kids. Yes, it started with them, but it has become so trendy now that there are so many stories of girls who were princesses and boys who did all the boy things, and who were very typical for their sex, getting swept up into this because it's the new antidote to everything. But to bring it back to your question, what was your question again?
I was trying to work out what has driven it. Is it just social media? Is it social pressure? Where's the impetus come from?
I'll tell you what I think. In the gender critical community where I spend a lot of time dialoguing, there's a lot of talk about social contagion, the influence of the internet and peers. That's definitely a huge part of it. Something there's not quite as much talk about, that, you know, I cannot provide any authoritative information on this as just a therapist and a podcaster who's interested in this topic, but something I think we ought to be dialoguing about more is the possibility that there is also an endocrine component. So for example, if you look at the work of Dr. Shanna Swan, who wrote a book called Countdown, I haven't read that book, but I listened to interviews with her where she cites numbers like a 50% decline in testosterone levels and sperm counts in males over the last 50 years. We also anecdotally hear a lot of these, especially the trans-identified girls who weren't very typical for their sex, having higher androgen levels and disorders associated with that, like PCOS, for instance. So if you consider the environmental contamination from plastics and pollutants, a lot of those same chemicals that are associated with endocrine disruption
Mhm.
are also associated with autism. And again, we see that kids with autism are a lot more vulnerable to getting swept up in this belief system. So I think there could be a biological component
Sure.
that lends some credibility to this feeling, I don't feel fully male or I don't feel fully female. Where I disagree is that the fact that you maybe have lower levels of your own natal sex hormones, or, the fact that something is off there on a biochemical level, I don't think means that the solution should be further endocrine disruption by
Sure.
further suppressing your own natal sex hormones and going the opposite direction. I think we need holistic, ethical endocrinologists to investigate what's actually going on with young people and how to help them in the least invasive ways possible. So I think there is that component. But then on top of that, you have social media, smartphones, you have pornography, exposure to incredibly violent, degrading pornography that can do a number of things to kids of both sexes. So for girls, it's often exposure to pornography or some kind of sexual assault or molestation, or even just learning that a friend or a sibling was molested. That can really scare girls, like, oh, that's what it means to be female. Well, then I don't want to be that. And even for boys, the pornography combined with the Me Too movement and the social justice ideology that's so prevalent now can make them feel so deeply conflicted about their own sexual desires that they sort of seek refuge in this autogynephilic fantasy land. So I think there's a lot of energies converging. And then
Mhm.
I also believe that there is some kind of agenda behind all of this. And I would
Mhm.
recommend people look into the work of, for example, Jennifer Bilek, 11th Hour blog, where she investigates the money behind this agenda to
Sure.
normalize transgender ideology and its connection with transhumanism.
Wow,
Interesting.
interesting. So what are you saying then that really gender dysphoria doesn't really exist in that, and I may not be wording this correctly, but the people that think that they've been born in the wrong body, that they, if it's a male and they think they should have been born in a female body, that there's more going on here than simply somebody saying, no, I was born in the wrong body. There's got to be more to it than that. And that's pretty much for pretty much all of these cases is what you.
So believing that you should have been female is a uniquely male experience, just like believing that you should have been male is a uniquely female experience. And these beliefs are often coping mechanisms for, again, uniquely male or uniquely female experiences. So, for example, the experience of feeling vulnerable as a female to sexual exploitation and abuse, that is a female experience.
Sure.
Seeking refuge in the
Mhm.
shield of a masculine identity doesn't make it any less female. Similar with the sexual fetishes that are often associated with this for males. Now, if we're talking about the definition of gender dysphoria, that's, first of all, I want to say that the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders is a highly politicized document, and it's always being revised. When I was in graduate school between 2010 and 2013, we were still using the DSM-4. We were being told, hey, the DSM-5 is coming out soon, so let's learn what we can about it. And in that change from DSM-4 to DSM-5, the categorization went from gender identity disorder, in which the emphasis is on the problem of the identity, to gender dysphoria, in which the emphasis is on the problem of the distress that is subjectively experienced as being related to this perceived mismatch between mind and body. But if you look at the definition, and I'm happy to grab my DSM if you want to go over it in greater detail, it basically comes down to someone saying, I just don't feel like I fit these stereotypes. Okay, there's a number of reasons a person could not feel like they fit those stereotypes. One is that they are pre-gay. I don't believe children have a sexuality. They have the nascent, beginning emerging feelings, but they don't really develop sexuality until puberty.
Mhm.
But for some of these kids, and we all know, right, that effeminate boy that you described, Peter, is more likely to grow up gay. So for some kids, it's just an indicator that they're likely to be gay. We also know, again, there's this huge correlation with autism. And one reason for that is that kids with autism have a harder time picking up on social cues and
Mhm.
just sort of unconsciously absorbing the unspoken rules of interaction. And when it comes to autistic females, for example, a lot of female behavior is really subtle. And there are, there's one message being spoken verbally and a completely different message being
Mhm.
spoken through actions and tone and posture. So, can you blame an autistic female who's not good at reading those cues for ending up in a place where maybe she feels hopeless about being unlike uh, other girls, not really understanding? Maybe she has an easier time relating to boys because they're more straightforward. There are just so many reasons that a young person could feel that they don't fit those stereotypes. And then there's also reasons related to trauma,
Mhm.
whether that's trauma the individual has experienced directly or the trauma exposure to violent pornography or learning that something horrifying has happened to someone you love. All of those can cause someone to scapegoat their body. And then finally, there's just an imaginative play,
Mhm.
which is, earlier in childhood, and so really it depends on the age of the person, but earlier in childhood it's normal to play with different roles. And right now we have these these woke parents who are just a little too eager to recognize any sign that their kid is trans so that they can be one of the special parents. And in that, we really have to look at the narcissism of the parent.
Yeah.
Hmm,
Yeah. Yeah. Good
absolutely.
point. Good point.
Yeah, I mean, nowadays I'm hearing that it's wrong to bring up a boy and a girl with, little boys with trucks and blue clothing and, like the overalls, Peter, and then the little girls in the dresses, and everybody should just be gender neutral. Everything should just be neutral. And I just think that is, I'm sorry, but that's to me sad to, not encourage or allow children to embrace their own genders, basically.
It
Um,
denies the reality that we are different and that maybe there
Mhm.
are good reasons that we are different, that we have sexual differentiation, not only for the purpose of making babies, but if you think about in a natural environment, um, throughout pregnancy and gestation, a woman is vulnerable. Of
Of course.
course, the man should be physically stronger and more prone to aggression.
Mm.
Otherwise, how is the vulnerable mother and baby going to be protected? And similarly, Leonard Sachs does excellent work on sex differences. So here's another one. Females, our sense of smell becomes incredibly sensitized through repeated exposures to the same smell. Male sense of smell does not change at all. So
Yeah.
I think there's a good reason for that. Yeah, let the men deal with the gross, stinky things and the heavy lifting to protect us women when we're attending to the important details of nurturing life. And there are about a million other ways that we are sexually differentiated. Now, that doesn't mean that those who are, again, atypical for their sex shouldn't have their place in society or be free to choose what kind of role they want to play in their family or at work. But there are definitely reasons that males and females are different. And, I'm helping raise kids who are in the public school system who are being exposed to all this. I wouldn't if they were my own biological children, but because I'm a step parent, I don't have a say in that. And I see evidence of this all the time, just how they're being pushed to use they, the neutral pronoun for everyone, that they're being trained to not see male and female as different. And that's all fine and good before puberty, even though there are sex differences in children from a young age. But the more sexually differentiated we become, and not only sexually differentiated, but differentiated in every aspect, the more important it is, I think, for young people to be told the truth
Mhm.
about what
Absolutely.
makes you unique as a male or a female.
So Stephanie, how
Absolutely.
do you help parents of these trans-identified children better communicate with them? How do you teach that?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's essentially almost everything I do right now. So it depends. So I work with parents in a variety of situations, ranging from, I'd say probably the youngest kids right now are 13. The oldest are in their late 20s. So we have all the way, from young, vulnerable ages in the home and still very impressionable, maybe close relationship with the parents, to very estranged relationships with the parents, male and female. And then I have families from different cultures, different religious backgrounds, different parts of the country, different socioeconomic statuses, and different levels of, again, closeness or estrangement, and also contentiousness in the household. So part of it depends on just the unique circumstances of that family. I also have, divorced families, blended families, intact nuclear families, and everything else. Um, so then one thing I look at in a lot of families is what I call a trifecta of the trans identity with social justice ideology and personality changes. And those personality changes tend to be consistent with what in psychology we call cluster B personality disorder type behaviors. I'm not diagnosing these kids with cluster B personality disorders, but when you look at their behaviors, there are behaviors that we would see in higher rates in people with borderline, narcissistic, or antisocial personality disorders, as well as histrionic. So when we see this sort of personality psychopathology emerging in conjunction with radical social justice ideology and trans ideation, they almost always go together in this trifecta. So one thing I do is I help parents understand how the three are connected. I also help them understand what I would ascertain their relative level of risk to be. So I'm looking for indicators of ambivalence, however immaturely that ambivalence might be expressed, versus how much this kid is really drunk the Kool-Aid, chomping at the bit to medicalize, how quickly the clock is ticking based on how, close they are to 18, what the laws are in their state, which I recommend every parent familiarize themselves with. So we do sort of a risk assessment. Like, is your kid at imminent risk of medicalization that could have permanent consequences? Some of these families, their kids are already medicalizing, so it's just they're trying to see, like, is there a way I can get through to my son or daughter who's already on these drugs before they, have more long-lasting consequences. So we do the risk assessment, and sometimes it seems like the thing that is most at risk is the character development of the individual because of that personality component of the trifecta. I'm like, I want to help you protect your kid from the ideology and from its impacts on his or her physical body, but also you want your kid to grow up to be a good person. And these things are just so linked. So that's where the strategic communication comes in. I use moral psychology concepts from Jonathan Haidt. I use Peter Boghossian and Chris Voss-based communication techniques, including communication techniques using hostage negotiations. Take a lot into account about the developmental psychology of the individual. So for example, a lot of these young people, I would say it peaks between like 17 and 19. There's like a peak of hubris when a person is in late adolescence, early adulthood, and there's a lot of moral fervor behind their beliefs, a lot of sort of FU attitudes, but they haven't had to put any of it to the test. So we work with the teenagers or the young adults' ego and their defenses as well. So for example, one thing I discourage a lot of parents from doing is providing too much information to their kids because they think, oh, if only I provide this information on this study on, the negative effects of puberty blockers, blah, 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 blah. They're just hoping their kid will see the light. Usually what it does is just cause them to double down further on their cognitive distortions that allow them to maintain their existing beliefs, in part because the ego of the individual who's wrapped up in this ideology says, I am smart. Nobody can fool me. It's other people who are easily fooled. I'm the smart one, right? So you can't threaten that type of ego head on, or you will be met with greater defensiveness. So I teach parents techniques for appealing to their teenagers' higher self, to that person's sense of self, for framing the issue in a way that does not threaten that person's sense, I am so smart, nobody can fool me. And then I also work on the parents' own emotion regulation, their boundaries. Sometimes controlling their financial boundaries or their communication boundaries is the only thing they can do. I work with parents who are supporting their kids financially and not getting anything in return while their kids are, maybe parents are paying the kids way in college, and then the kids in college are spending all their time obsessing over gender ideology and going to the student health services clinic to be affirmed. So sometimes we work on, are you ready to make some difficult choices about setting boundaries with what you will support with your money? And if so, we have to come up with a plan that you're going to be, guaranteed to follow through with. That's another thing is, just general, like, any problems with the parenting that might have always been there, like, for example, inconsistency with limits, which teaches kids that if they just push you hard enough and get abusive and obnoxious enough, you will finally cave in. Anything like that that was pre-existing, or a weakness in the marriage, for example, that was pre-existing, this ideology will exploit it and make it that much worse. So sometimes we have to go back to, bad habits that the parents have been in since their kids were very young. And those are just a few components. Really, I could talk about this all day because it's what I do.
Okay,
Wow.
very much.
So here's one for you, and it's just come to me while you've been talking. I lived most of my life in Africa, and autism was amongst tribal people, but even amongst the European population, was virtually unheard of. And I read recently that the rate of autism in North America, I think, is 1 in 40 for kids, but in the Amish community is something like 1 in 12,000. I can't remember the exact figures, but it's 1 in the thousands, right? So, do you have any data on this transgender issue in A, the third world, or B, in communities in North America who are excluded from social media, a lot of the environmental problems? Do you have any of that data?
That's a great question. I don't, especially not off the top of my head, but I think that's really interesting to look at. I would suspect that it would be a lot lower. And I would wonder about, with the lower rates of autism in those communities, excuse me, things like, exposure to environmental contaminants, maternal and paternal age at conception, and as well as early childhood rearing practices, because there there's a lot to be said for the importance of building building the primitive structures of the brain in the first few years of life through nurturing, through close contact with mom, dad, and maybe a handful of close relatives. I recently hosted a debate that I will be airing soon on this. I don't know if you guys saw the thing that blew up over Twitter where I basically expressed that babies need their mothers and that it's unfortunate that children are being put in daycare so young. And so the internet went wild about it. And I hosted a debate with, or not, excuse me, not a debate, but a group conversation with some other women on this topic. So I'd be curious, in tribal societies or in Amish societies, how much human connection there is with the most important caregivers in the early life, and whether that helps establish those structures of the brain that are responsible for socializing and things like that, and emotion regulation. And then I
Yeah.
would think downstream of that, we'd see lower rates of mental illness in general.
I'm sure you're right. And I saw that furore on Twitter, and I couldn't understand why people were getting upset about it, because you were talking common sense. But then I'm an old guy, so maybe that's why I thought it was common sense. So following on from that, I would add to what you've just said that in many of those groups, tribal people in Africa and elsewhere, Asia, Amish community, children are generally part of larger families with many times 8, 9, 10, 12 siblings. Plus, from early childhood, children have duties to do, and they have responsibilities like collecting eggs or sweeping the floor. Black children, when I lived in Africa, can walk from the age of 5 or 6. When they start school, they might walk 3 or 4 miles to school every day, barefoot and in terrible weather. And they will compete even physically to get a place in that classroom. And they'll come home and do their homework by candlelight with a broken pencil and a scrap of paper, right? And they will strive to get better. I believe put all that in the mix, and that's part of the reason we see less autism and less of these social problems there's other problems in those parts of the world, sure, but I think there's a lot going for the traditional way of life.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So you have the factor of sibling socialization, how much we learn through observing others, close in age, but also having some stratification of different
Hmm.
ages and a mixture And then responsibility. So I think it's about the mind and body developing in
Yeah.
sync with each other rather than in this disassociated way. If you think about it, gender so-called dysphoria is like peak dissociation. It's
Yeah.
I am not my body. I am the antithesis of my body. And in order for me to be happy, I have to mutilate my body until it resembles the like that is peak dissociation. But things like, getting up in the morning and collecting the chicken eggs, like you said, it's a very embodied act, being closer to nature, working with our hands. And I think it's so important to support children developing in ways where their mind and body developing are synced up.
Yeah.
And where they're learning that they can be efficacious in their environment to reduce things like existential anxiety and dread from just, being flooded with information about all the terrible things happening around the world.
Right. Right.
Sorry, Kathleen, another very quick one while I
Mhm.
think of it.
Mhm.
Stephanie, you mentioned an agenda before, and I'll come back to the agenda in a moment, but I read that the average North American woman has 1.7 children right at the moment, of European descent, certainly. And statistically, each woman should produce 2.2 children to keep the population stable. And it's even worse in Japan, which is just above one. And I think South Korea is under one. So is this part of the agenda to reduce the world population? Because the more transgender people you have, the less reproduction you're going to have, correct?
I don't know. I mean, I hesitate to endorse any given speculation because then I get labeled a conspiracy theorist,
No,
which,
sure.
it wouldn't be the first time. But I don't blame people for wondering whether there is some kind of depopulation agenda going on. And I think there are people who have looked way further into that than I have.
Yeah,
Right.
sure. Even if it's not part of the agenda, it's a symptom of what's happening. If more and more people become transgender, as it's called, and unfertile and don't reproduce, the population is going to drop. It's
Yeah.
simple maths, is it not?
Mhm.
And just for anyone who doesn't already know this, who might be listening, these trans procedures are sterilizing.
Yes,
Um,
absolutely.
Puberty blockers delivered early in adolescence not only almost guarantee sterility, they also almost guarantee that that person will never even experience orgasm. If they never had an orgasm prior to taking puberty blockers at Tanner stage 2, then they never will. So there's that. Then there's that taking cross-sex hormones can have a sterilizing effect, and then certainly surgeries, of course, such
Yeah.
as oophorectomy, hysterectomy, things like this are, of course, by their very nature, sterilizing. A lot of
Right.
people don't realize that
That's
who are
right.
new to this.
Right.
And a lot of people don't realize the complications that can come from those surgeries.
Mhm.
Plus, surely once you start interfering with hormone balances, you predispose people to certain types of cancer, do you not?
Mm.
Yeah, so I'd recommend anyone concerned with this issue should read the WPATH Files report. I recently, actually, the day that we're recording this is the day that my episode dropped on my podcast. My podcast, You Must Be Some Kind of Therapist, with Mia Hughes, the author of the WPATH Files report. And that is anyone can read it. It's available free on the Environmental Progress website. And sorry, I forgot what. Peter, what was
Now
the last thing you said?
we were talking about the consequences of surgery. The last point I made was that if you interfere with people's hormone balances, you can predispose them to certain types of cancers.
Oh, yeah. Sorry. Thank you. So in the WPATH Files report, there's hard evidence that the people at the World Professional Association for Transgender Healthcare, which claims to be the leading authority on this issue, are aware that they are causing cancers, including liver cancer in 16-year-old females taking testosterone. There's also a significantly elevated risk of all manner of heart disease, cardiovascular, metabolic, and then we also know about the impact on bone health, brain health. Just about everything in the body depends on endocrine balance. And when
Sure.
you can't just swap out estrogen for testosterone and
Oh.
expect everything to function normally, because every single cell of the body is impacted.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And I'll just add for our audience that I have been watching that episode of Stephanie's podcast just before we started recording this show. It is really well worth watching or listening to. There'll be
Thank you.
links in the description. So thank you for that. Sorry, Kathleen, I've monopolized Stephanie.
That's quite
So
all right. No, this has all been so fascinating. But Stephanie,
back to you.
in 2022, you participated in the film No Way Back, The Reality of Gender Affirming Care. Can you maybe talk with us a little bit about some of the cases that you encountered?
Oh, sure. I'm happy to. So, we follow 5D transitioners and 1D sister. So their stories include, history of autism, right, which we talked about before, history of having been bullied and sexually assaulted, which caused sort of scapegoating of one's own sexualized body parts. We also had, a young man um, whose version of masculinity didn't fit his father's definition. And we have people who were gay and were struggling to realize that about themselves and turned to gender ideology as a way of sort of escaping or delaying that process or being in denial about it. And there's just, yeah, such a great, I think, balance of stories of detransitioners and how they originally fell into the idea that they were born in the wrong body, what their hopes and dreams were for it, from this idea of gender transition. The initial stage of so-called euphoria that you hear so much about if you follow this issue online, which was, I think, can sort of be summed up as a combination of the placebo effect of having the expectation that this thing is going to transform your life and the mood altering effect of taking these drugs. And then the point of unraveling, where things started to fall apart, where they started to experience both the negative physical consequences, but also the psychological breakdown of, oh my goodness, I thought that this was who I was and this was the path to happiness. And I realized I was misled and now I'm even further from where I need to be. And then from there, the film zooms out and looks at how did we get here? And so that's where we bring in therapists like myself, also doctors, journalists, reporters, and various perspectives on how this scandal in the medical industry has ended up targeting young people like this.
Ah.
Okay.
Why, Stephanie, why do you think society at large, certain segments of the first world, North America, Europe, and many groups of parents have sort of voluntarily surrendered the care and education of their children to the courts, to government agencies, and to promoters of these ideologies? What's happened? Why have parents surrendered that?
Gosh, that's a broad question. I mean, the parents I talk to certainly are not interested in
Sure.
sacrificing their parental rights. Um, but but I do think there's something to be said for how to put it, like this sort of big brother mentality.
Hmm.
What am I looking for here? There's been this widespread normalization of outsourcing the raising of very young children
Absolutely.
to
Mhm.
others outside of the home. And I talked about this earlier, and it's one of those hot button issues that it's really hard to talk about without people accusing you, even me, of having like anti-feminist views,
Hmm.
just for saying, hey, maybe moms and babies do belong together. And maybe the idea that that a woman should go back to work immediately after having a child isn't actually in the best interest of the woman or the child.
Or the child.
But it's just become so normalized to outsource care of very young people to experts outside the home. And there's been this sort of like this overlooking of what's right under our nose, which is the very most important thing. The very most important thing for young children is the bond with the parents. Everything else is secondary to that. But I think parents have overlooked their own importance and become sort of anxious and fear-ridden, like we have to read all these parenting books from the experts and we have to listen to what the experts say and we have to send our kids to the experts and missing out on the most important ingredient the whole time. um and I think that sort of, that expert mentality has sort of caused people to, I mean, it shapes the way parents treat therapists too. And I
Yeah.
hear from parents all the time who are looking for referrals for trustworthy therapists for their gender questioning youth. And I will provide those referrals if I have them. Like I have a private list that I keep of therapists who have personally reached out to me saying, hey, I share your concerns, where I might say to the parent, well, here's someone licensed in your state who might be able to help. And there are certain websites and directories like Therapy First or conservative counselors that I can send people to as well. But I also caution parents, like, you can't just send your kid to some expert and expect that that's going to solve the situation. Like you ultimately need to work on your relationship with them yourself.
Absolutely. So we are running out of time for today, Stephanie. I just wanted to ask you, though, you did mention that you have your own podcast and it's called You Must Be Some Kind of Therapist. I just wanted to know, what types of guests do you typically have on your show?
Oh boy. Well, we're over 100 episodes in now.
Good for you.
I didn't intend it to be singularly focused on gender, but I'd say about half of my conversations are either with detransitioners or with mental health professionals who are concerned with this issue. But I also have sort of heterodox voices on issues like race relations and other things that the culture is interested in. We talk about psychedelics, and overall health stuff. Yeah, I'm trying to think of what my recent episodes have been about. Yeah, so I had Mia on recently to talk about WPATH files, Joe Burgrow on to talk about the crisis affecting young men.
Young men.
And then in the near future, like I said, we have that episode coming out where we talk about early childhood development and the relationship with the mother, especially. Yeah, anything related to health and well-being. But I have found that I've become sort of pigeonholed on the gender issue by accident, partly because it's what my audience seems to want, and it's the circle that I swim in. But it's also that sometimes experts on other topics who I would otherwise enjoy speaking with don't want to go near someone who's talking about this issue, which is really unfortunate. I at one
Yeah.
point I was going to
Absolutely.
be on. I had an exchange planned with the host of a popular podcast who's written some books on like cognitive distortions and recognizing all the ways that we can be wrong. And I at first was so excited. I was like, oh, someone is willing to cover this issue who's got expertise in this. I thought it was all very related. Like, here's someone who's going to be willing
Yeah.
to examine how we got this wrong as a society. And then as he looked further into my work, he was like, I'm never talking to you again.
Really? Oh dear. Oh
It's
dear.
really
Oh dear.
unfortunate. For some reason, it's a hot button for a lot of people,
That's right.
especially in today's society. And it's unfortunate that we're not allowed to talk about it openly and have these discussions. I think it's so important. But Peter, do you
Absolutely.
have any final thoughts?
I do have a couple of final thoughts, and the first one is picking up on what Stephanie just said. Dr. Joseph Burgo, was it?
Mhm.
I listened to that episode of yours, which came up a few days ago. He mentioned something there that stuck in my mind, and that was outward bound courses, and it sort of picks up from what we were talking earlier about the physical activity and connecting with the mind. And I remember outward bound courses where I grew up were very popular for troubled teenagers or young men and women. They were sent off into the mountains with qualified instructors, and they had to use ropes, and it was pretty rugged, and they had to sleep rough, and they came back changed people. So that's another good episode if anyone wants to watch that one. And then one question for you. This is a personal question. As I said earlier, I've been following you on Twitter or X for quite a while and watching how people attack you. How did you build up the resilience? You seem to manage to remain aloof from all that. You don't take you answer very tolerantly and politely and factually, but you don't back down, and B, you don't seem to let it get you down. How did you build that resilience?
Well, then I'm doing a good job of creating the illusion that it hasn't affected me. It really has. It's been very stressful. But I don't know. I think just the patterns you develop after being a mental health practitioner for 10 years, you learn to center yourself and come across as calm for other people, regardless of what's going on inside. So I think it's just sort of habitual for me to come across as calm, even when I'm not. I do think that there are some things that I would do differently if I could go back a few
Sure.
years because the stress really did affect my health. Um, but I think I just have some sort of general principles that help keep me sane. For one, I have nothing against blocking. A lot of people on Twitter or X have ridiculous ideas about why people shouldn't block other people. And I'm like, I'm here in my free time. I'm not
Hmm.
getting paid to be here. I'm getting paid a minuscule amount by X, not enough to really care. Um, And you know, if someone is here to attack other people and strawman them and use ad hominem and all of that, like they are here for different purposes. I think about what are my own principles, right? I rarely, if ever, make the choice to publicly criticize anyone. If I make the choice to publicly criticize someone, it is because I feel like it's gotten to a point where that is necessary for the public good. And I've done that like a handful of times in my life. Because my view of human nature is I just don't put people on pedestals, and I don't knock them down off of pedestals. And
Right.
so when people do that to me, when people put me on a pedestal and then knock me off of it, or you know, attack me on the basis of character, trying to instill some kind of fear in me that I'm just deep down a terrible person, like I think I've done enough work on that fear and that shame in myself, the fear that deep down I'm such a terrible person, that other people can't hook me emotionally with that, and I can evaluate their behavior. Like, would I ever treat someone this way? Do they have a view of human nature that is compatible with my own view of human nature, or are they just here for drama? And so I allow that to filter things out. But yeah, I made it through a lot with going through the attacks on my license and all the ways people have tried to intimidate me. And I wouldn't say I was completely unscathed, but I do have some principles to kind of keep me grounded. And I do not hesitate to block people
Good for
online.
you.
Well
Good.
done.
Yes.
Congratulations, because you do it
Yes.
a lot better than most. So
Yes.
Thank you.
my last little piece, and then I'll keep quiet and let Kathleen take over. Stephanie, thanks for being on our show. I really enjoyed this. We could go on for hours. Find everything we've discussed fascinating. And for our audience, our watchers and our listeners, thank you very much for being with us. You've seen another fantastic guest today. There will be more coming. To make sure you don't miss out on our future guests, hop onto our website, theyakkingshow.com, hit the purple button at the top or the bottom of the homepage, sign up for our newsletter. We only send you one email a week. We just tell you who's on this week, who's coming next week, and a health tip or two, and then you won't miss out. So once again, Stephanie, thank you. Back to Kathleen.
Yes, that's it. Well, Stephanie, before we go, please let us know, how do people contact you?
So I have two websites. There's sometherapist.com, and that's a website for everything related to my podcast.
Okay.
And then at stephaniewinn.com, that's where you can learn about therapy, which I'm again currently on a break from, and consulting. And anyone can book a free 15-minute discovery call right there on stephaniewinn.com. I ask people to please not email me and don't try to get in touch with me through like commenting on social media or YouTube or anything like that. I do appreciate ratings and reviews of my podcast, YouTube comments, and so on. But if you are trying to get a hold of me, please just book a meeting. You can do that through my website.
Fantastic.
Okay, but just to confirm, you're quite happy for people to go to your YouTube channel, for instance. Is that what's the address of your YouTube channel? Sometherapist.com?
Well, it's youtube.com/@sometherapist, and Some Therapist is my handle on X, which is the platform where I'm most active.
I will put those links for our audio listeners. Those links will be in the description.
Well,
Thank
thank you so much for being with us today. It was just absolutely enlightening. Thank you. And thank you also very much for tuning into our show. We so appreciated having you. If anyone is interested in being a guest on our show, we invite you to visit us at theyakkingshow.com. All you need to do is click on the contacts tab, where you will find a short application form, and we'd love to hear from you. So until next time, take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.